Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How would you enable connectivity between an Amazon EC2 instance in a VPC and a private REST API deployed using Amazon API Gateway?
I would create an application load balancer and a VPC link, then configure private integration between API Gateway and the ALB. Finally, I would use the ALB's DNS name to access the API.
After merging with a small staffing company, how would you manage billing and access policies for multiple AWS accounts?
I would create the Organization Account Access Policy (IAM) policy in each member account and connect them to the management account using cross-account access.
What changes would you make to the current architecture to reduce operational overhead and support an increase in orders for a product release?
I would create an EC2 auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer, add additional read replicas for the database instance, set up Amazon Kinesis data streams, and store static content directly in Amazon S3.
How would you address the bandwidth issues for a growing remote workforce using AWS?
I would migrate the home directories to Amazon FSx for Windows File Server and create an AWS Direct Connect connection from the on-premises data center to AWS.
What steps would you take to encrypt unencrypted Amazon EBS volumes and ensure future compliance across multiple AWS accounts?
I would create a snapshot of each unencrypted volume, then create a new encrypted volume from that snapshot, detach the existing volume, and replace it with the new encrypted one. Additionally, I would create an organization in AWS Organizations, set up AWS Control Tower with mandatory controls, and categorize the accounts into organizational units.
How would you authenticate users of an intranet web application hosted on Amazon EC2 using AWS Directory Service for Microsoft Active Directory?
I would add the directory as a new IAM identity provider. Then I'd create a new IAM role for SAML 2.0 Federation, configure a role policy for ALB access, and set the role as the default authenticated user role for the identity provider. Finally, I'd create a listener rule for the ALB and specify the authenticate OIDC action.
What solution would you recommend to achieve the fastest failover time for a website with a back-end service in AWS?
I would recommend setting the TTL to 4 seconds for the existing Route 53 record sets used for the back-end service in each region.
What steps would you take to restrict access to specific AWS services for multiple DevOps teams using AWS organizations?
I would review the AWS Trusted Advisor report to identify services recently used, remove the default full AWS Access Service Control policy, and also remove the default Deny AWS Access Service Control policy.
How would you design a scaling solution for a ticket application on AWS that experiences high utilization during sale events?
I would use a scheduled scaling policy for the EC2 instances and host the database on an Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL multi-AZ-DB instance with automatically scaling read replicas. I would create an Amazon Event Bridge rule that invokes an AWS Lambda function to create a larger read replica before a sale event and fail over to it. After the event, another event bridge rule would scale down the red replica.
How would you configure a cloud backup for an intranet application using AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery while ensuring replication traffic does not travel through the public internet?
I would create a VPC with at least 2 private subnets, 2 NAT gateways, and a virtual private gateway. Additionally, I would ensure that during the configuration of the replication servers, private IP addresses are used for data replication. Lastly, I would set the launch settings for the target servers to ensure that the recovery instance's private IP address matches the source server's private IP address.
How would you deploy a customer-facing image storage solution on AWS that can handle millions of users and significant demand variance?
I would use Amazon Simple Queue service to process the S3 events when users upload images. An AWS Lambda function would resize the images and store the resized files in an S3 bucket using S3 standard infrequent access. I would also set up an S3 lifecycle policy to move all stored images to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 6 months.
How can a company using AWS organizations reduce compute costs while maintaining operational flexibility across departments?
The company can configure AWS organizations for consolidated billing, implement a tagging strategy for departments, use Tag Editor for resource tagging, and purchase compute savings plans.
How can a company improve the performance of uploads to an Amazon S3 bucket while ensuring that only authenticated users can post content?
A solution is to set up an Amazon API gateway with a regional API endpoint as an S3 service proxy. You would configure the PUT method to expose the S3 PUT object operation and secure the API gateway using an AWS Lambda authorizer. The browser interface would then use API gateway instead of pre-signed URLs for uploads.
How would you migrate a company's IT portfolio to AWS while maintaining centralized payment and IAM control?
I would use a collection of parameterized AWS CloudFormation templates to define common IAM permissions and require all accounts to launch these stacks. Additionally, I would use AWS organizations to create a new organization from a payer account, inviting existing accounts to join and creating new ones as needed.
How would you improve the resiliency of a solution that analyzes weather data from various stations to ensure no data is lost?
I would create 2 Amazon Simple Queue service queues, a primary queue and a secondary queue. The secondary queue would act as the dead letter queue for the primary queue. Then, I would update the API to integrate with the primary queue and configure the Lambda function as the invocation target for that queue.
What steps would you take to improve application performance visibility during peak traffic events for an e-commerce website on AWS?
I would configure the Aurora MySQL database cluster to publish slow query and error logs to Amazon CloudWatch logs. Additionally, I would enable and configure AWS CloudTrail to collect and analyze application activity from both Amazon EC2 and Aurora. Lastly, I would enable performance benchmarking for the Aurora MySQL cluster and publish that stream to AWS X-Ray.
How would you design a scalable application architecture for a company experiencing increased traffic with minimal development effort?
I would migrate the back-end services to AWS Lambda and configure DynamoDB to use global tables.
What would you recommend for a company migrating to the cloud that needs to collect metrics from its existing data center environment?
I would recommend enabling AWS Application Discovery Service in the AWS Management Console and configuring the corporate firewall to allow scans over a VPN.
What solution would you recommend for providing static IP addresses for a SaaS application running on AWS, while ensuring customers are routed to the closest region?
I would recommend creating an Amazon CloudFront distribution. Then, I would set up a custom origin for the network load balancer in each additional region and provide customers with the IP address ranges of the distribution's edge locations.
How can a company prevent developers from terminating EC2 instances that belong to other development units in a shared AWS production account?
One solution is to pass an attribute for development unit as an AWS Security Token Service session tag during SAML federation. Then update the IAM policy for the developer's assumed IAM role to include a deny action with a string not equals condition for the development unit resource tag and AWS principal tag development unit.
What actions would you take to build an infrastructure services platform for an enterprise company on AWS, considering their specific requirements?
I would upload AWS CloudFormation templates as AWS Service Catalog products to portfolios in a central account and share these portfolios with the organization's structure. Additionally, I would allow user IAM roles to have Service Catalog end-user access permissions using an automation script to manage central portfolios and tags. Lastly, I would utilize the AWS Service Catalog tag option library to enforce the required tags on products.
What solution would you propose to prevent the increasing query time for AWS WAF logs in Amazon Athena?
I would modify the Kinesis Data Firehose configuration and the Athena table definition to partition the data by date and time. Then I would update the Athena query to reference the relevant partitions.
How would you restrict access to a web application running on Amazon EC2 instances, allowing only users from a specific country?
I would configure AWS Shield to block any requests that do not originate from that country and associate it with the application load balancer.
How would you design a disaster recovery solution for a legacy Windows file server migrating to AWS?
I would create an FSX for Windows File Server in the Disaster Recovery region, establish connectivity between the VPCs using VPC peering, and configure AWS DataSync to communicate through interface VPC endpoints with AWS Private Link.
What database solution would you recommend for an application requiring a recovery point objective of less than 5 minutes and a recovery time objective of less than 10 minutes, while also needing to fail over to a secondary region?
I would recommend deploying an Amazon RDS instance with a cross-region read replica. In case of a failure, the read replica can be promoted to become the primary.
How would you create IAM users in a new AWS member account for a digital wallet application?
I would sign in to the AWS Management Console using the root user credentials with the 64-character password from the initial AWS organization's email sent to finance11yourexample.com, and then set up the IAM users as required.
How would you address memory errors in a serverless REST API that is experiencing increased traffic?
I would modify the Aurora Serverless DB cluster configuration to increase the maximum amount of available memory.
How would you migrate a MySQL database with sensitive data to AWS while ensuring data security and minimizing downtime?
I would perform a database backup and use AWS DataSync to transfer the backup files to Amazon S3. I would ensure server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed encryption keys for data at rest and use TLS for encryption in transit before importing the data to the DB instance.
What storage solution would you recommend for a big data analytics cluster on AWS that requires high availability and compatibility with POSIX?
I would recommend provisioning a new Amazon Elastic file system that uses max I/O performance mode and mounting it on each EC2 instance in the cluster.
What disaster recovery strategy would you recommend for a SaaS solution hosted on AWS that uses an Aurora serverless database?
I would recommend changing the Aurora Serverless database to a standard Aurora MySQL global database that extends across both the source and target regions. Additionally, I would use AWS SAM to create a runbook for deploying the solution in the target region.
How would you ensure high availability for a travel application on AWS that experiences increased load during content updates?
I would set up Amazon Elasticache for Redis to handle caching, update the application to use Elasticache, create an auto-scaling group for the EC2 instances, and set up an Amazon Cloud Front distribution with the auto-scaling group as an origin. Finally, I would update the Route 53 record to point to the CloudFront distribution and manually scale up the EC2 instances before the content updates.
How would you design an image processing solution for a mobile app that experiences peak usage during weekdays?
I would have the mobile app upload files directly to Amazon S3 and use S3 event notifications to create a message in an Amazon MQ queue. Then I would invoke an AWS Lambda function to process the images when a message is available, along with using S3 batch operations for additional processing.
How would you enable developers to access Amazon OpenSearch service from their local machines while meeting the requirement to store all data within a VPC?
I would create and configure a Bastion host in a public subnet of the VPC. Then, I would set up the Bastion host security group to allow SSH access from the company's CIDR ranges and instruct the developers to connect via SSH.
What steps are required after deploying a containerized architecture on Amazon ECS to meet security requirements?
I would apply security groups to the EC2 instances and use IAM roles for those instances to access other resources. Additionally, I would apply security groups to the tasks and pass IAM credentials into the container at launch time to access other resources.
How can Lambda functions access an Amazon Neptune DB cluster and DynamoDB tables in a VPC?
One solution is to create 3 public subnets in the Neptune VPC and route traffic through an internet gateway while hosting the Lambda functions in those public subnets. Another solution is to create 3 private subnets in the Neptune VPC, host the Lambda functions in those isolated subnets, and create a VPC endpoint for DynamoDB to route traffic.
How would you design a disaster recovery solution for an application that writes to an SMB file share and needs to copy data to AWS?
I would deploy an Amazon S3 file gateway and configure it to use Amazon S3 standard infrequent access for both the metadata files and image files.
What solution would you implement to enable remote work for 400 employees while integrating with the on-premises Active Directory?
I would use Amazon Workspaces as the cloud desktop service, set up a VPN connection to the on-premises network, create an AD connector to connect to the on-premises Active Directory, and configure a Radius server for multi-factor authentication.
What solution would you implement to help agents flag spam calls in an Amazon Connect contact center?
I would use a contact lens for Amazon Connect rule to identify spam calls. Additionally, I would use an Amazon DynamoDB table to store the spam numbers and modify the contact flows to invoke an AWS Lambda function for reading and writing to that table.
How would you design a system to stream and analyze environmental data in real time using AWS?
I would stream the data to an Amazon-managed streaming for Apache Kafka cluster. Then, I would set up a trigger in Amazon MSK to invoke an AWS Fargate task for data analysis and use Amazon Simple Email Service to notify the operations team.
How would you ensure that an Amazon EKS cluster can effectively handle an unpredictable number of stateless pods?
I would configure the workload to use topology spread constraints based on availability zone.
What disaster recovery solution would you implement for a web application running in a single AWS region with microservices on Fargate?
I would set up a second ECS cluster and ECS service on Fargate in a separate region. I would create an AWS Lambda function to take a snapshot of the RDS-DB instance, copy it to the separate region, create a new RDS-DB instance from that snapshot, and update Route 53 to route traffic to the second ECS cluster. Additionally, I would update the event bridge rule to invoke the Lambda function.
How can a company track Amazon EC2 usage and receive alerts for significant increases?
The company can enable AWS Trusted Advisor in the management account and set up a cost optimization advisory alert. This will notify the architecture team if EC2 usage exceeds the average usage from the last 30 days by more than 10%.
How would you design a highly available and loosely coupled order processing application on AWS for an e-commerce company?
I would use AWS step functions to receive the orders and launch an Amazon ECS container to process them.
How would you manage database credentials for AWS Lambda functions that access an Amazon RDS for PostgreSQL database, ensuring they are secure and can be rotated automatically?
I would store the database credentials in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store, encrypting them with an AWS Key Management Service key. The Lambda functions would pull the credentials using the AWS SDK for Python, and I would add a role to the functions to access the parameter store.
How can a company prevent Amazon EC2 instances in an AWS Control Tower organizational unit from gaining a public IP address?
They can create an AWS config custom rule to detect instances with a public IP address and set up a remediation action using an AWS Lambda function to detach those IP addresses.
How can you restrict access to a third-party web application on AWS for a specific list of users while ensuring they are authenticated with multi-factor authentication?
I would create a user pool in Amazon Cognito, configure it for the application, and populate it with the required users. Then, I would set the pool to require multi-factor authentication and configure a listener rule on the application load balancer to require authentication through the Amazon Cognito hosted UI.
What steps should a solutions architect take to successfully deploy a security tool using an AWS Cloud Formation Stack set in new AWS regions?
The architect should specify the capability, named IAM capability, and the self-managed permissions model during the creation of the stack set.
How would you improve the reliability of an application using an Amazon Aurora PostgreSQL DB cluster during high traffic periods?
I would configure instance scaling for the DB cluster to activate when the database connections metric is near the maximum connections limit. Then, I would update the Lambda function to connect to the Aurora Reader endpoint.
How would you enable sensors to send data to AWS only after they are installed, given that each has a unique serial number?
I would create an AWS Lambda function to validate the serial number and an AWS IoT Core provisioning template that includes the serial number parameter. Then, I would add the Lambda function as a pre-provisioning hook, register the certificate authority with AWS IoT Core, specify the provisioning template, and set the Allow Auto Registration parameter.
What solution would you recommend for a startup that needs to manage build and deployment processes on AWS for their e-commerce website?
I would recommend using GitHub webhooks to trigger the code pipeline, along with the Jenkins plugin for AWS Code Build for unit testing. Alerts for any bad builds can be sent to an Amazon SNS topic, and I would suggest a blue-green deployment using AWS Code Deploy to ensure zero downtime.
How can a SaaS company effectively allocate DynamoDB costs to each tenant in a multi-tenant environment?
The best approach is to associate a new tag named Tenant ID with each DynamoDB table and activate it as a cost allocation tag in the AWS Billing and Cost Management console. Additionally, the company should deploy new Lambda function code to log the tenant ID in Amazon CloudWatch logs, and then use the AWS Cost and Usage Report to separate the costs for each tenant.
How can a company protect data stored in an Amazon S3 bucket for a year against potential security breaches?
The company can enable Amazon Guard Duty with the S3 protection feature for the account and region, and also add an S3 lifecycle rule to delete objects after 1 year.
How can a company ensure that all backend services in their web application on AWS respond only to authenticated users?
They can enable AWS CloudTrail to log all requests to the application load balancer and create an AWS Lambda function to analyze those logs, blocking any requests from unauthenticated users.
How can a company achieve a centralized view of the security state across multiple AWS accounts using AWS Control Tower?
The company can use AWS Cloud Formation stack sets from the AWS Control Tower Management account to deploy an AWS Config Conformance pack to all accounts in the organization.
What is the next step in transferring 60 TB of software images from Europe to an Amazon S3 bucket in the AP Northeast 1 region?
The next step is to deploy an AWS Data Sync agent and configure a task to transfer the images to the S3 bucket.
What change would you recommend to improve response times for a web application that uses API Gateway, Lambda, and DynamoDB, especially after a marketing campaign increased demand?
I would recommend implementing DynamoDB autoscaling on the table.
How would you migrate an application with a web front end from an on-premises data center to AWS while ensuring high availability?
I would migrate the application to Amazon EC2 instances in 3 availability zones. I would use Amazon Elastic File System for file storage and mount it on all 3 EC2 instances. An application load balancer would be used to direct traffic to those instances.
How would you collect information about network dependencies when migrating an on-premises data center to AWS?
I would install the AWS Application Migration Service agent on the on-premises servers for data collection. Then export the data from AWS Migration Hub in CSV format into an Amazon CloudWatch dashboard to generate the network diagrams.
What solution would you recommend to improve the performance and availability of a SaaS application using an Amazon RDS for MySQL database during peak periods?
I would recommend migrating the database to Amazon Aurora, adding an Aurora replica, and configuring Amazon RDS proxy to manage the database connection pools.
How would you migrate an application's data storage from on-premises to AWS while still allowing access through SMB?
I would create a new Amazon FSx for Windows File Server file system. Then I would configure AWS Data Sync with one location for the on-premises file share and another for the new Amazon FSx file system, and create a data sync task to copy the data.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.